So that brings us up to the mid 80s or so. And one of the things that's well, it's important. I had a heart attack in '89, so that that kept me out of circulation for a while. But before long, there were more things to do, and one of them is I got a letter, not from Wisani, but from one of his brothers, a fellow named Levi Binengim. And Levi was the chair of the Free to Mine Landowners Association. It was a group that had been formed of basically Telefolmin people and some of their neighbors around the Free to Mine. And they wanted me to come and to do a consultation and a documentation of the basis of their claims to the resources at the mine. It turns out one of the things I knew on the basis of my previous surveys is that Min people and Telefolmin people weren't the only people around there. And there were at least 4 or 5 different ethnic groups who had plausible interests in that mine site. And so one of the difficulties is if I were to file an official report claiming to document the land rights for that area, if their rights weren't documented, all that would do is create trouble, and it would also cast suspicion on whatever report I would write. Fortunately, I had 2 colleagues who were working in the region among people who did have plausible claims to that. One of them was Don Gardner, who was at Australian National University at the time. And the other was George Moran, an American anthropologist from Rutgers University. And Don was working with West Mian people off towards west of the area near the border. But he was familiar with the region as well. And George Moran was working with the next door neighbors of Telefolmin there, who are the Mianmin, who are indeed Min people and descendants of Effect, but mortal enemies of Telefolmin. So the agreement was that I would agree to work on this survey for land rights or land claims, providing they were to have plausible workers dealing with the other people. There was a 4th group, people living downstream, down by the river, an anthropologist named Rune Paulsen, Scandinavian anthropologist, worked in that area and managed to interest him in that. So the proposal we put both to the government and to the mining company was to say, we will undertake to do this, but it has to be on these terms. And that means you're probably going to get more than one picture for one area, and that's because that will reflect the reality. Okay, and you're better off knowing that than not. So that's the way we went into it. And we also negotiated a further thing, which is we could publish the results of our work, whether the mining company liked it or not. If they wouldn't agree to that, then we wouldn't do the work. So they agreed to that. And that resulted in a paper that I wrote called Who and What is a Landowner, the 1997 paper, that talked not only about rights and stuff like that, and none of the sensitive details about Telefolmin claims in the area, but rather what was involved in trying to document land ownership and what some of the difficulties were about that. First of all, local people had to be their own anthropologists. when they're trying to figure out what on earth do these officers think a landowner is, right? And they quickly realized that they seem to have a model of patrilineal kinship and patriclans, which is what they're used to from other parts of Papua New Guinea. So we better have patriclans pretty much, and they started creating patriclans, things like that, and that sort of thing. And there was an awful lot of noise in the system. And the other thing that the mining company wanted, and the government would have found very convenient as well, was to have no overlapping rights, right? Very, very clear boundaries with very clear ownership on one side. So we only have one party to deal with. But in fact, in Papua New Guinea, or at least in that part of Papua New Guinea, that's a fantasy. That's not how things go. Okay, these boundaries are fuzzy, and even or some often if precisely people tell you they're not. So in order for that to work, it was necessary to have the four of us set off on this project and produce that, and we did. I wish I could say that it solved all problems, but actually the problems that were present at that site had less to do with conflicts over claims to rights and more to do with the mineral market and the difficulty with the site itself. What I should say at that time is that for Telefolmin, the people that I was most centrally concerned with, they found themselves now positioned between two different mines. There was the mine, the Frida mine in Anataman, where this potential land dispute was in the works. But no minerals had been taken out of there, and the mine to the south, the Ok-Tedi mine that grew up around the Tabubil site, where that airstrip was that I passed along with David Heineman in my first fieldwork. In the interim, that mine had become the world's second largest copper mine. It was in its heyday, shortly after opening. It was also the largest single contributor to the national economy of Papua New Guinea in terms of revenues that it generated. It was a mammoth project. It still is a mammoth project. They essentially had to dismantle an entire mountain because the ore just went all the way down, process it on site. They had to build a plant there to produce the stuff. They had when the thing got operating, they had about 2,000 employees. By agreement with the government and with local people, preference in hiring and training had to be given to local people, to people from the region. Okay, so it was a huge source of income for that area. The town that grew up around that mine, Tabubil, around that airstrip, had become, by the late 1980s, early 1990s, had become the largest town in Western Papua New Guinea. That doesn't sound like a lot to our ears, but well in excess of 20,000 people living there. Okay, so going from a place that had maybe 65 or 70 people at the camp to start off with, that was a big transformation. The ore had to be gotten out of the area. Very expensive to fly ore by aircraft. That's not the way you want to do it. There's a deep water port at the town of Kiunga, south of Tabubil. They built a highway to connect Tabubil with the deep water port at Kiunga. They have shipping coming up from the Gulf of Carpentaria between Australia and Papua New Guinea. They have ocean-going ships coming up to Kiunga port to load ore and then take it offshore for processing someplace. It's a mammoth operation covering several jurisdictions, involving thousands of people, millions, I probably would say billions in these days, but lots and lots and lots and lots of money. A huge operation. And one of the things that was really important for local people is, okay, what's our share? One of the things that's really important from the point of view of Telefolmin and their neighbors is that the site for the mine is underneath a place called Mount Fubilan. Okay. Now, see, I showed a picture of this. That's Phoebe. Mount Fubilan is called that because it's the source of these. So the source of traditional stone wealth is now the source of copper mining wealth. That's an interesting coincidence. So what does that have to do with people whose place that is? That's where the land of the dead is. What does that have to do with that? Where are our rights there? That's a really big issue for people there. And as far as they're concerned, it's not coincidental that it's at Fubilan. Of course it's at Fubilan. Everybody knows that's what it should be. So there is being prolonged, very intense negotiations, struggles, competition between various claimants. Telefolmin aren't the only ones who have claims to that site, and so on. And that's a big thing. Beyond that, the site itself is incredibly controversial because of several elements. But the big one was when the mine was shown to be possibly profitable, when they had good quality ore there, and they decided to go ahead. They did something called fast tracking, which something only the mining industry seems to understand. What fast tracking is that you have a whole series of processes. Let's say drilling for oil. Let's say another one is processing the ore. Let's say another one is building a road. Another one is getting rid of tailings. Another one is building a tailings dam, all those kinds of things. To fast track the operation means you start all of those processes simultaneously, which means they started it before a tailings dam was completed. As they were completing the tailings dam to hold the debris, the tailings from the mining operation, the dam was wiped out in a landslide. The Papua New Guinea government was a partner to this project and had invested huge amounts of money to get it going. They agreed to let that go ahead, to let the mine begin production and go ahead before they had a tailings dam in place. They never actually completed a tailings dam there. And so what that means is that those tailings were dumped into the headwaters of the Ok-Tedi River as part of the normal operation. And they produced tremendous damage downstream. I have a colleague named Stuart Kirsch, who's done an awful lot of work both on behalf of the people who live around there, the Yongom people and their neighbors, about the damage that's been done to that stream, about the claims that come from it. The story is still not over, but at least one big part of it is the T and the plaintiffs, the Yongom people, brought a lawsuit against the mine's developer, BHP, in the Australian courts because that's where BHP was based. They couldn't get the lawsuit going in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea government wasn't going to hear that. They sued them in the Australian courts, and the courts ruled they had jurisdiction. And one of the ways that got started off is that at a shareholders meeting where BHP, the mining company, was doing their annual general meeting, they're talking about how they were environmentally conscious and this, that, and the other thing. And one of the Yongom people had become a shareholder, had bought shares in the mine so he could attend the meeting. And as the chair or the board people were telling the shareholders that everything was just fine, so this other fellow got up and brought with him a large, visibly deformed fish, dumped it on the table and said, "Then how do you account for this? Deformed fish in the river. You have flooding on both sides of the river. You have sago swamps that people depended for their livelihood on, being choked off by silt from the mine, possibly toxic, and that kind of thing." So this was a very controversial thing. The result is the courts went against BHP, and they decided, in order to they paid some damages, but they decided in order to have no further liability, they had to wash their hands of the mine because this problem was going to continue. So BHP pulled out. They made a settlement. A large part of the settlement was put in Singapore banks. And one might wonder what the reason for putting them in a bank in Singapore might be. They were put in low-risk securities. and they were to set up a long-term fund for the benefit of the population in the area affected by the mine. That was a long-term fund. One of the other things that happened is that the Papua New Guinea Sustainable Development Corporation was declared a shareholder. A former prime minister was made the chair of it. And their job was to administer those funds and also to provide benefits to plaintiffs and to people in the communities around the mine and who had an interest in the mine, and access to services such as a first-class hospital. The Tabubil Hospital was, if not the best, certainly the second best hospital in the country. Local people had access to that. The mining town itself, Tabubil itself, was as a result of strike by telephone workers mainly. They decided that they committed to that being a residential mining community, not fly in, fly out. So that meant there were family homes there, there were schools there. One of the best high schools in the country was put up there. They had a town where the streets were clean, garbage was picked up regularly, there weren't law and order problems. In fact, it was kind of a model in a number of ways of what one hoped that Papua New Guinea towns might be if they were prosperous. And that was what set the tone there. So there is this mine that never seems to get going to the north. There's this mine that Telefolmin don't have they can't really say it's theirs, but they can say they've got at least a share in it, part of it. And in the meantime, it's the chief employer for people from the area. They were paid extremely good wages, had good working conditions, at least by Papua New Guinea standards for sure. And it was a portal to the outside world. There was an international airstrip there that had direct flights to Australia and other places. The school, as I said, was a feeder school for universities in Papua New Guinea. And the healthcare was wonderful, was very good stuff. So we have the horror show, the nightmare downstream from the damage that the mine has caused and the hardship that it's caused for people there. You have the sustainable development program from the caretakers of the cash settlement from BHP. You had a new consortium running the mine, but with the Papua New Guinea Sustainable Development Program having the majority, the government having the majority hold of that mine. And that's how things went for a while until at one point, the Papua New Guinea government decided that they really wanted to have access to those revenues rather than turning it over to the Sustainable Development Program just for local people. These were national revenues, not just provincial revenues. And so the issue of provincial status, relations with the national government became quite vexed, quite difficult. Before it met its ultimate demise, one of the things the Sustainable Development Corporation did, or program did, was something that coincided with recent technological developments, not just in Papua New Guinea, but elsewhere. They funded the construction of cell phone towers throughout the impact area of the Ok-Tedi mine, and in fact, the northern part of Western Province, which meant that people whose complaint about the world had been that they were the last place that anybody ever got to, that anything ever got to. They were at the end of the line. They had no access to anything, to services, all of those kinds of things. They now could be connected with relatives in the capital, for example, or relatives in town, that kind of thing. They could arrange for payment of school fees, all kinds of things that were very important to them, a completely different situation that many welcomed very importantly. So you have the intersection of a kind of moribund mine to the north that doesn't seem to be going anywhere, this mine to the south that's creating all kinds of pollution, but actually is also producing all kinds of benefits for the people lucky enough to be living upstream from it. And pardon me, and then the government coming in and swooping it and taking it over, which changes the game entirely. So this is the regional context which affects not just the people who are defendants of AFEC and how they see them, but in fact, a whole hinterland of people living in the area beyond the mine who provide the workforce, as well as people who depend on it, the town of Tabubil or Kiunga for medical services, educational services, and commercial services. And that happened, in retrospect, it looks like it happened very much the way Revival did, overnight, just like that. Since then, things haven't been completely perfect, but it's still a place that the Ok-Tedi mine is considered a prime employer until my most recent installment here. And the town itself has been for some time considered one of the better places to live in Papua New Guinea. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll return to what happens next.